Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. In the past few episodes of the podcast series on learning how to really study your Bible, as opposed to just reading it, I've focused on the issue of how critical it is to take the Bible in its own context, not a context that's familiar to us, like modern evangelicalism or the Reformation. I want to transition now to another important area of real Bible study, learning to read the Bible in terms of the various types of literature found in its pages. Now, in academic biblical study, thinking about the type of literature means studying the various genres of literature. A genre of literature can be simply understood as a kind or type of literature. You may not have thought consciously about this, but you already know intuitively that there are many different kinds of literature, or if you prefer, many different kinds of documents or texts. Each of them brings with it certain expectations about what you would normally find in that type and what you wouldn't. For example, think of all the different types of writing you might run into in the course of a day. A letter, a comic book, a newspaper, maybe a legal brief or summons, a blog post, a bill, an invitation to some event, maybe a sales sign or a billboard, a bus schedule, a book, a sales receipt, how about a menu, and so on and so forth. Each one of those, in fact, can be broken down into subcategories. Let's take the sales sign. You could have a sign for a house sale, a yard sale, a garage sale, an estate sale, maybe a sale for clothing or a car, and on and on. And as I said at the outset, each one of those brings with it certain expectations. If these expectations aren't met about what you expect to find in that piece of writing, you might think whoever created the document or the sign or whatever was incompetent. Or you might think maybe they were simply trying to draw your attention by violating the expected conventions of that piece of writing. For example, you wouldn't expect to see a description of a burger and a fries in a court summons. And if your lawyer did something like that when he or she presented you with the will you asked for and paid for, you'd immediately know you needed a better lawyer. If someone who sent you a wedding invitation didn't include the time or the place, you'd wonder about the competence of whoever wrote that. We'd find it irritating, in another example, if when we were preparing an account for business expenditures for which we expected to get reimbursed by our company, that some of the receipts didn't include the date. Any account worth his or her salary would catch that and disqualify it as an expense. On the other hand, if we were flipping through a novel at a bookstore and noticed that it had a bibliography, something pretty atypical for fiction, that might catch our attention and probably lead us to conclude that the author paid a great deal of attention to historical or scientific accuracy in the course of writing his or her fiction. Examples like that could be multiplied many times over. What I want you to do over the course of the next few episodes is to get you to consider that knowing that understanding the type of literature you're reading within the Bible, and there are many that appear, that those things, those types, are important for interpretation. Discovering what you're dealing with in a type of literature will tune your mind to think about the text in a different and a focused way. You'd surely need the right mindset to interpret a legal document, for example, as opposed to a comic book. The latter requires you to suspend your belief or your disbelief, and the former demands attention to detail and a conscious need for defining terms in the legal world, the world of the author. Your mind essentially braces itself to work a certain way when it knows what you're looking at. Now, I want to start with one of the most frequent literary genres or types in the Bible, and that is narrative, perhaps better grasped as storytelling. Narrative would include nearly all of the Old Testament except what is known as wisdom literature or poetry. That is, most of Genesis through 2 Chronicles using the English order of the books. is narrative. And even the prophets, the biblical prophets, also have a lot of narrative material in them. In the New Testament, we have the Gospels and Acts. They're largely narrative. Now, all of that adds up to being better than half of the Bible is a story. It's storytelling. It's narrative. Believe it or not, there is a way to read a story intelligently. My recommendation, I've said this many times in lectures and whatnot, and if it's a Christian audience, they usually look at me and someone will recoil in horror when I say this, but I really mean it. My advice is that you read the Bible's narratives like they're fiction, just like you would read a novel. Now, I don't mean to say that the content is fictional, although that happens. Rather, if you read narrative like it's a novel, your mind is immediately tuned in a way that will aid you in observing things in the text intelligently. When we read a novel, for instance, we have an intuitive sense that the author of the material, the author of the fiction, the story, is trying to do something to us, maybe misdirect us at times, or to embed some word or some scene or some character in our brains that we somehow know that we need to follow. We need to look for them again. That we expect that item to reappear or to get repurposed elsewhere in the material as a vehicle for telling the story. Fiction writers like to say that they're helped in their writing technique by reading fiction closely. What they mean by that is they try and discern what the writer that they're reading is doing to them and how they're accomplishing it. In academic study of literature, this is called close reading. Close reading involves, paraphrasing some writers I've read on this topic, putting every word and phrase on trial, seeking to understand why a writer chose that word instead of another one, why a writer repeats certain words and phrases in a dialogue, perhaps, or discerning which words in a sentence can have double meaning, and then pondering if there was intent in that word choice. In short, you have to read evaluatively, trying to guess at what's being done to you by the seemingly minor decisions in word choice that a writer makes, or by the seemingly minor decisions in the way a character gets described, which means, by the way, looking at what is said about a character and what isn't, what's withheld. We do this unconsciously to some extent when reading a novel. We store things away mentally, expecting that a person or a thing or a place has importance for plot and messaging. Now, you might also think about this using television, especially crime dramas, or maybe movies or motion picture dramas as a template. You know, when you're sitting there watching whatever it is you're watching, that the director, whoever put this thing together, had only a defined period of time to tell the story. And so you have a sense that every character in the story that isn't just somebody walking around in the background is put in front of your eyes for a reason. They must have some role to play. And so what they do or say when they're on the screen has importance for either propelling the story or solving a riddle or finding some resolution in the plot line. Now, I especially like the Sherlock Holmes movies and the recent BBC remake called Sherlock for this illustration. And I'd read all the Sherlock Holmes stories in book form, and so I was sort of tuned in automatically to what was going on in the movies and in the new series. But I like it because it really makes the point well. When we finally get, if you're watching one of these, or if you read a Sherlock Holmes story or any detective novel, but I especially recommend Sherlock, when you finally get the resolution to what Sherlock has been investigating, and the important components of the scenes are played back for you in the case of the films or TV, you can see that everything you needed to know was hidden there in plain sight. You actually saw all of it. And Sherlock, as he himself says, he isn't guessing, he's seeing. Our eyes just aren't as trained as his. We also lack his heightened ability to ask questions about what he sees and then make intelligent deductions. That's all he does. And if you watch these films or the movie, you'll see that everything you needed to get to his conclusion, you were shown all that stuff. But you weren't used to doing two things that you need the most. You weren't used to seeing and asking the right questions. And that's what we need to do when we read biblical narrative. We need to do two things. We need to see the text, and then we need to ask questions about what we see. Reading biblical narrative as fiction is the way to begin this. It's a way to begin the process, since our brains are more accustomed to searching the pages of a novel with the thought that the writer is up to something than when we read something else. The problem is that we read the Bible like we read textbooks, and that just kills inquisitiveness. Read the Bible, read the biblical narratives like a novel. Read it like the writer had an agenda or a plan, because he did. Now, by way of a suggestion list for seeing the text, here are some things you might look for. Symbolism. Again, words that are used that you sort of intuitively either know or you have to wonder, am I to take this at face value or literally or some other way? And then you want to start tracing, following that breadcrumb elsewhere in the biblical text, especially within that story. You might want to look for repeated images or repeated words or ideas, or words or phrases that sort of just jump out as important. They come at a critical point in the story. You might also look for words or phrases that can be interpreted in more than one way, either in terms of deliberate ambiguity or irony. You might want to look for figurative language, or look at the characters and the roles they play in the story. You do all this with fiction intuitively. You don't even have to think about it. It's a reflex. And what I'm suggesting is you take that mindset, you take that brain setting with you when you approach narrative in the Bible. Now, by way of illustrating how much can be gained from this method, I want to read from chapter 6 of a book by an expert in biblical narrative and its analysis. The book is by Shimon bar Ephrat and is entitled Narrative Art in the Bible. I'll put a link to it under the Bibliography and Resources tab at www.nakedbiblepodcast.com. Now, be advised, it's a scholarly book, but frankly, there's really nothing better for this. Now, our example comes from the first two verses of 2 Samuel 13, which is the tragic story of Amnon's rape of Tamar. I'd recommend opening your Bible right now, or later if you can't, and then listening to this part again. But open your Bible right now and read the whole chapter, 2 Samuel 13. And if you're really ambitious, the next two chapters, the extended story, the fallout. And then come back to these first two verses in the chapter, 2 Samuel 13, 1 and 2, and listen to this part of the podcast again. But for the sake of the podcast, just follow along. The first two verses say this: Now after this, Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister, whose name was Tamar. And Amnon, David's son, loved her. And Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. That's the quote. That doesn't seem like much is going on. But now listen to what Ephrat sees, or how he thinks about what he sees, what we've just read. Quote, The narrative begins with an exposition in which the characters are introduced. We're told four things about the protagonists: their names, Absalom, Tamar, and Amnon; their family relations, David's son, sister, and again, David's son, in the order of the characters. Third, we're told about Tamar's external appearance. She's beautiful. And lastly, we're told about Amnon's feelings about Tamar. He loved her. All these four features are crucially important for the narrative. The names are needed, of course. so that it will be possible to identify the characters in the narrative. The family ties between the individuals are important because they constitute the basis of the imbroglio on which the narrative stands. Tamar's beauty is undoubtedly the reason for Amnon's love for her, which in turn provides the motive for all that follows. Thus, everything in the exposition is essential for understanding the narrative. The structure of the first verse should be given some attention. The same information about the characters could have been conveyed by constructing the verse differently. For example, it could have read this way, quote, "Now Amnon, David's son, loved Tamar, Absalom's sister, who was very beautiful," unquote. Although virtually the same information is conveyed here as in the biblical verse, there are fine differences which are significant. The biblical verse is built in such a way that in addition to communicating information about the characters, it also hints about what is to come. For instance, Absalom, David's son, is mentioned at the beginning of the verse. This is surprising because he plays only a minor role and only then at the conclusion of the whole chapter. It would have seemed sufficient to have introduced him then, stating his relation to Tamar. In any case, it's remarkable that he, rather than one of the principal characters, either Amnon or Tamar, is given a prominent position at the beginning of the first verse. It would seem that he's cited here because of the central role he is to fulfill in the later developments following Amnon's rape of Tamar. This means that even though the narrative of Amnon and Tamar can be regarded as a separate and complete story, complete literary unit, the opening verse indicates that it only serves as a prologue or a first stage in the chain of narrative units that are to follow. The real point is going to be Absalom. Absalom, David's son, opens the verse, and Amnon, David's son, closes it, while Tamar is in the middle, between the two brothers. This structure reflects the situation which is to arise in the future, when these two sons of David will confront one another, and Tamar will be the cause of the dissension and disharmony between them, much later in the story. There's nothing in the verse to indicate that the friction between the two brothers is the result of a conflict of political interest between them, namely rivalry over the succession, since David is not referred to as the king in this verse. Had he been referred to as the king in the first verse, then you'd get a hint of a political rivalry, but you don't get any of that. Rather, what you're going to get is a table setting, a main event that will cause the tension between these two. The tension between Absalom and Amnon is based on family ties. Tamar is the axis, and her two brothers are at the opposing poles. Going on, now in contrast to Absalom and Amnon, each of whom is defined as David's son, Tamar is called Absalom's sister and not David's daughter. This should be regarded as intimating that she and Absalom have the same mother, even though further on in the narrative, she's also called Amnon's sister by all the characters, David, Amnon, Absalom, and Tamar herself, including the narrator. The reference to her as Absalom's sister is appropriate to what happens later when Absalom, rather than David, acts on her behalf and avenges her humiliation. Unquote. Now, what we learn from Ephrat's reading is what to see and what to ask about what we see. We see the characters, but did we think to ask why they're in the order they're presented in? In the Old Testament, order like this, a sequence, can be telling, especially with respect to birth order or wife order or child order. The orders are not accidental or careless. They convey something about pecking order in the house, or the dynasty, or preferential disposition of a parent or a king, or rank and influence, on and on. That is, a simple detail like order reveals other details of family dynamics and even ruling dynamics. Further, would we have thought to ask why Tamar is characterized with the word sister instead of David's daughter? Would we wonder, as we read the story, why Absalom just disappears after the first verse? Apparently, he's a pointless reference until the outcome of the story in 2 Samuel 13 and beyond. After seeing the outcome, that David did nothing about the situation except get mad, while Absalom punished the guilty, would that have made us realize that the whole episode is in some way propelling the larger story of Absalom, his antipathy toward David, his father, and his motive for stealing David's kingdom later? I don't know. But if we're thinking like we're reading fiction, we would have these sorts of things floating around in our head. I wonder why I'm reading this here instead of somewhere else. I wonder why the writer chose this word instead of that one. I wonder why the writer told me this but didn't tell me some other things that I would think he should have told me, or that would sort of go here. Why the omissions? Now that's how to read a story intelligently. And we, again, sort of do it intuitively when we read fiction. That's why I recommend read biblical narrative like it's a novel. Now you might think, boy, this is a lot of work. Well, are you here to study the Bible or just read it and forget it? Sure, it's work. But as my favorite quotation about biblical studies says, the tasks of scholars are not for sissies. We all have to start someplace, and you'll get more out of biblical stories if you begin to read them like fiction, training your mind to think that the author is up to something, that it's all deliberate, because it is.
Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. You might notice I have a bit of a cold this week, but just bear with me. In the last episode, I turned our discussion of studying the Bible to the area of literary genre, how knowing what type of literature within the Bible you're looking at matters for interpretation. We began last time with a discussion of how to intelligently read biblical narrative. That was called close reading. In this episode, I want to focus on the genre of law or legal literature. This genre will overlap in significant ways to the earlier series on interpreting the Bible in light of its own context, that of the ancient Near East for the Old Testament, and the Second Temple period for the New Testament. Now, legal literature has a long history in the written materials of the ancient Near East. Law codes have survived from ancient Near Eastern literature that predate the Old Testament by centuries. There's a good deal of comparative legal material that can inform our reading of the Old Testament when this genre is present. By way of a brief overview, I'd like to quote selections from the Law, Prophets, and Writings blog, where Rusty Osborne has provided a succinct summary. Two of Rusty's observations are pertinent to the present discussion. He writes, ancient law codes functioned as prescriptive or positive law and were intended to be applied by the sovereign, the king or the ruler, whoever, throughout his empire. The law was legally binding and meant to be observed. He also writes, some have argued that ancient laws were characterized by a theory of jurisprudence or applied law. As a result, legal codes became compilations of sentences passed by judges and making the judges the authors of the law codes. Unquote. In other words, what he's saying there is that law codes in the ancient Near East are sort of like compilations of precedent, what we have today when any lawyer, any Supreme Court decision either tries to argue a case or rule on a case, there's a whole body of precedent that they refer to see how others have ruled. Old Testament law has a lot in common here. Let's turn to a specific case where knowing that the legal genre exists when it comes to studying the Bible in its literary context is really helpful. I think you'll see the value of interpreting this passage in its wider ancient Near Eastern legal context. Now, the passage I'm thinking of is Exodus 21, verses 22 to 23. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her child or children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life." Unquote. In case the interpreted problem isn't clear, let me unwrap it a bit. We have a bit of case law in Exodus 21 in which two men are fighting and accidentally hit a pregnant woman. As a result, the woman loses the child she's carrying, either in the sense that the injury caused her to give birth prematurely, or she miscarries. Discussion of the passage focuses on the legal issues that extend from the event. The phrases, "if there is no harm" and "if there is harm" are the key issues. The first phrase is followed by a penalty of a fine. The second is followed by the death penalty. But it's ambiguous as to whose life is lost with respect to the second phrase that incurs the death penalty. Now, the passage can be read as follows. The first phrase is read as, "If there's no harm to the woman, then the one who hit her shall be fined according to what her husband demanded, and the judges decide. But if," and here's the second phrase, "there is harm," in other words, the woman dies, "then the one who hit her must be put to death." Now, in this scenario, the focus of the harm is the woman in both cases. If she survives the incident, the penalty is a fine. If not, then the penalty is life for life, the death penalty. But what about the child? Since the Hebrew behind the phrase, "that her child come out," is elsewhere used for miscarriage and not live premature birth, that is, there's a biblical usage precedent for seeing it as a miscarriage, but not a precedent, that's clear anyway, for a live birth, even though that's possible. Many people argue that this passage values the life of the woman more than the miscarried child, because there's no death penalty named for the child that was miscarried. In other words, the focus is only the woman. The child's death is just completely incidental. Now, this assumes, of course, that the loss of the child resulted in its death. The passage doesn't actually say that, but that's certainly possible. So here's the question. Does this biblical passage show a higher estimation for an adult woman than a fetus? This rationale has been used to justify abortion, most famously by the Southern Baptist President Bill Clinton during his campaign and presidency. Now, the answer to the question is no. Aside from the ambiguities in the passage, rendering any such opinion of it tentative, the genre of the passage needs to guide its interpretation. Now, in terms of genre, this is legal literature. As such, it is not a philosophical or theological treatise. Legal literature is about crime and punishment. It's not designed to make theological statements about whether a fetus was considered a person or not. Fortunately, there are clear parallels in the ancient Near East of this type of literature, and even more significantly, the same kind of legal scenario. Let's take a look at the famous law code of Hammurabi. Now, lines 202 through 214 in Hammurabi's code concern crimes of assault and their punishment. Let's read those lines. We'll begin with line 202. If a man has struck the cheek of a man who is more important than he shall be struck in the council 60 times with an ox tail. 203. If one man has struck the cheek of another such man of similar status, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. Now notice in these first 2 lines, the issue is social status. That's going to become important. Line 204. If a working man has struck the cheek of another working man, again a lower status here, he shall pay 10 shekels of silver. 205. If a man's slave has struck the cheek of another man, they shall cut off his ear. Now let's stop here again. You'll notice that in those 4 lines, the social status of the person concerned has declined. It's gone from an upper to a lower social status. Let's continue. 206. If a man has struck another man in a brawl and has injured him, that man shall solemnly declare, I did not wound him intentionally. It is he who shall be responsible for the physician. In other words, he has to pay the doctor bills. 207. If someone has died in that brawl, he shall similarly make a solemn declaration, and if it was a man's son, he shall pay half a mina of silver. 208. If he has a working man's son, he shall pay 1/3 of the mina of silver. 209. If a man has struck the daughter of a man and has made her lose her unborn child, okay, this is our parallel here, then he shall pay 10 shekels of silver for the fetus. Line 210. If that woman has died, they shall kill his daughter. In other words, the man who struck the woman and the woman died, he's going to lose his daughter. It's life for life. 211. If he has made a commoner's daughter lose her unborn child by the violence, he shall pay 5 shekels of silver. 212. If that woman has died, he shall pay half a mina of silver. 213. If he has struck a man's slave girl and made her lose her unborn child, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver. If that slave girl has died, he shall pay 1/3 of a mina of silver. That's the end of our section. Now notice in those last 2, because the child is the child of a slave girl, the fetus was the child of a slave girl, the penalty is lesser. And because the slave girl, if the slave girl died, there is no life for life. The person who did it doesn't lose his daughter. Again, it's very clearly dictated. These decisions are very clearly dictated on social status of the people and the child concerned. Now, if you were listening closely, you would have discerned all that. You would have discerned that there were a range of different payments for the loss of adults versus children versus the fetus, male and female, social status of the males. These victims, or these differences, have nothing to do with whether the victim was considered a person. Rather, the difference is derived from what social class the victim was in. Let me read a few lines again and listen for the differences. Line 209. If a man has struck the daughter of a man and has made her lose her unborn child, he shall pay 10 shekels of silver for the fetus. If that woman has died, they shall kill his daughter, the offender's daughter. If he has made a commoner's daughter lose her unborn child by the violence, he shall pay 5 shekels of silver. If that woman has died, he shall pay half a mina of silver. It's very clear here that though the woman and the fetus are valued differently, okay, one you pay a fine, the other one, if the woman dies, the offender loses his daughter, so it's life for life. That has nothing to do with whether the fetus is considered a person or not. It was, again, the social status, the social standing of the person involved, the victim. We can see that because when we get to the commoner's daughter in the last 2 lines, and she loses the child, then there's a lesser payment in both regards, both for the fetus and also for the woman herself if she dies. The issue is very clearly social status. Now, we have these differences in social class in these texts. Commoners are distinguished out, adult males, women against children, that sort of thing. These lines, again, value a commoner's daughter at half a mina of silver, whereas the death of a daughter of a man not described as a commoner results in a death penalty. Both were adults, yet there was a difference in valuation. One isn't more of a person than another. Again, it's very clearly social status. So the issue is social class, not personhood. You know, it's really inconsistent hermeneutics on the part of those who want to look at a passage like Exodus that we read early and want to use it to justify a modern issue like abortion, a modern hot potato like abortion, and then they turn around and want to talk about how the Bible is a product of its own time and culture and we ought to interpret the passage in context. Well, they're not doing that. They're imposing a modern issue on the text, and they're making the text speak like a modern philosophical or theological treatise when that isn't what it is, and it isn't what it was for. So this is an issue of genre. Other genres of biblical literature might be more apt to tackle, more highbrowed questions such as personhood, but legal literature isn't about that. Now, I hope this example shows that exploring the implications of biblical genre is important. As it pertains to our Exodus passage, if we're really going to interpret that passage in context, in its literary context, and of course in its ancient Near Eastern context, the passage makes no comment on the devaluation or valuation of a fetus. The reason that there are two different penalties in Exodus is not because the biblical writers thought that a fetus was not a person. It's because they were very consistent. They were a product of their own time and culture and literary culture in that they recognized different social classes and different penalties. Next time we'll look at another type of biblical literature. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. In the last podcast episode, we continued our series on studying the Bible in a way that amounts to more than reading by taking a look at the legal genre in Old Testament books. And again, a genre is a type of literature, and knowing what type of literature you're in helps with interpretation. Now today we're going to focus on another genre, military annals or military accounts. I think the best way of illustrating how this genre can matter for interpretation is to begin with a problem that it solves, one that biblical scholars have grappled with for centuries, in fact. Specifically, I'm speaking of the problem of the unrealistically large numbers in the Exodus and wilderness journey. Now, in case you aren't familiar with this famous biblical problem, let me explain. In the census following the Exodus from Egypt in Numbers chapter 1, specifically verse 46, the number of Israelite males older than 20 years of age is put at 603,550, which is slightly more than the second census taken later in the book of Numbers in chapter 26, which gives that total at 601,730. Now, these figures imply that the total population of the fledgling nation of Israel was somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. Those figures are very difficult to reconcile with the geography of Canaan and the archaeological record, and frankly, other biblical statements about the Israelites on the way to Canaan after the Exodus. Now, in what follows, I'll illustrate the problem from the biblical text and mention a commonly proposed solution. But then I'll introduce you to what I think is the best solution, one that derives from the type of literature we're dealing with in the Exodus and conquest narratives. Illustrating the problem, well, several passages illustrate the conundrums that are created by taking these large numbers at face value. For instance, Deuteronomy 7:1 through 7 presents Israel as, quote, the least numerous nation in Canaan at the time of the conquest. It mentions that there are 7 other nations that were larger. Now, if we take 2 to 3 million as the population of Israel, the total population of all 8 nations combined would have had to range from anywhere from 16 to 24 million people, roughly the 2010 population of Florida or Texas, respectively. The size of Canaan, however, is closer to that of New Jersey than either of those states. That presents a problem. Archaeological evidence does not indicate that enough cities and towns existed to support a population of this size. To be really blunt about it, it's nowhere close to accommodating that number of people. If you took every settlement, every village that's known in Canaan, you just can't get to enough settlements, and of course enough settlements that are big enough to accommodate 16 to 24 million people. It's an impossibility. A second example also helps put the problem into perspective. The Israelites left Egypt with, according to Exodus 12:37, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. That's a quote. God did not provide the Israelites with manna until roughly 45 days later after they left Egypt. That's according to Exodus 16:1. Now that means that 2 to 3 million people required a different food source than the manna for 45 days. If a family of 5 sacrificed 1 lamb or some other animal each day to feed themselves, the Israelites would have had to slaughter 120,000 lambs every day, meaning the Israelites would have had to leave Egypt with 5.4 million animals. Even if they ate meat only a third of the time, 15 days, they still would have had to slaughter 40,000 animals every day and leave Egypt with 1.8 million animals. I hope you're getting the picture here. The numbers just don't work. Lastly, with respect to the Exodus and conquest material, the Bible itself hints really strongly that the 2 to 3 million number is very likely a misreading of the biblical text. In Numbers 33:49, the Israelites, quote, camped by the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth as far as Avel Shittim in the plains of Moab, unquote. Now, since Beth Jeshimoth and Abel Shittim were approximately 7 miles from each other, the area of the Israelite encampment would have been about 49 square miles. By comparison, New York City, with a population of 8.1 million in 2010, covers 305 square miles. Taking the number 2 to 3 million at face value therefore requires that the Israelite camp had a slightly greater population density than New York City. And of course, in Canaan, in the ancient world, you don't have any multi-level living accommodations. There are no high-rise apartments. Again, the picture that we get from the math just doesn't work. Taking the numbers of the census figures at face value creates transparent difficulties in regard to the accuracy of these stories. And so several solutions have been proposed. I'm going to give you the most frequently proposed one. That is that the Hebrew word for thousand, which is Eleph, may also mean tribe or clan. Now in Numbers 10:4 and in Judges 6:5, 1 Samuel 10:19, the word Eleph there, which we would normally translate thousand, probably does simply mean tribe or clan. And so if that's the case, the numbers that we're thinking of in the book of Numbers, in the Exodus and conquest narratives, may simply refer to military units, which correspond to the aim of the census to determine the number of males eligible for Israel's army. In other words, the 603,000 or so people might just mean 603 tribes or clans or some other military unit. That would, of course, dramatically reduce the number of people we're dealing with. However, there's a problem. The examples where LF might plausibly refer to something other than the specific number of 1,000 often have nothing to do with counting. Moreover, in other passages that do involve counting, for example, Exodus 18:21, 1 Samuel 8:12, 2 Samuel 18:1, there are a lot of these, the term really can't have any other meaning than the mathematical tabulation. In other words, proposing that LF means something other than a numerical unit of 1,000 doesn't work in a lot of the contexts. So while on the surface the proposal seems kind of workable, it has its own internal problems. We need a different interpretive approach besides that sort of word study to solve this particular problem. Now, another proposal, and again the one that I think is the most workable and that really pays attention to the literary genre, is that the Exodus and wilderness wanderings, the numbers that are presented in those narratives, those historical annals, those military annals, represent literary hyperbole. Now, a friend of mine, David Fouts, actually did his dissertation work on this problem, so I need to credit him for the convenient examples that follow. Links to David's work can be found on the Naked Bible podcast site under Bibliography and Resources if you're interested. So to continue, comparisons with other ancient Semitic texts of similar genre validate David's suggestion. Ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian literature, particularly royal inscriptions and historical annals, deliberately employed hyperbole. They deliberately blow up the numbers in regard to the large numbers that are used. Historical annals aimed to glorify the god of the king by exaggerating the king's victories. This was deliberate, and everybody knew what was going on. In fact, the biblical accounts of the Exodus and conquest bear striking similarities to contemporary historical or military annals in other ways, in many ways, in fact. Scholars of ancient Near Eastern literature familiar with these genres, the genres of royal inscriptions and military or historical annals, have found a number of instances where the writers deliberately use outlandish numbers for army logistics and movements, or maybe troops engaged in battle, or the number of slain or captured enemies, or the amount of booty taken. It's just something that was regularly done in those genres. Now, by way of specific example, an inscription of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser I, who reigned roughly 1275 to 1245 BC, which, if you're interested, is the same chronological context of the Exodus and the conquest if one adopts the late date chronology. But again, the inscription of Shalmaneser I reads as follows, quote, "I slaughtered countless numbers of their extensive army. As for him, Satu al-Ra," that was his opponent, "I chased him at arrow point until sunset. I butchered their hordes. But 14,400 of them who remained alive I blinded and carried off. I conquered 9 of his fortified cult centers, as well as the city from which he ruled," so on and so forth, unquote. Now, while these numbers are likely exaggerations, an inscription by Shalmaneser I's successor, a guy named Tukulti-Ninurta I, certainly illustrates deliberate hyperbole. How do we know that? Because the predecessor precisely doubles the numbers found in the previous king's inscription. It's very deliberate. This second inscription of Shalmaneser I's successor, Tukulti-Ninurta I, reads like this. Listen. Quote, "On my accession to the royal throne in my first year of reign, I carried off 28,800 Hittite warriors from the other side of the Euphrates," unquote. Now you notice the number 28,800 is exactly double of the number that were taken by his predecessor, 14,400. It's exactly double. A fascinating example here of how a king might expect numbers to be exaggerated. There's another example, though, that comes from a cylinder inscription of Sargon II, another Assyrian king. It reads in part, quote, this sort of describes some of his activities. So, quote, palaces of ivory, mulberry, cedar, cypress, juniper, and pistachio wood did I build at their lofty command from my royal dwelling place. I built a Bit Chilani, which is a copy of a Hittite Syrian palace. I erected in front of their doors beams of cedar and cypress. I laid over them for roofs at 16,283 cubits, the numeral of my name. And I made a circuit, literally the measure of its wall, establishing the foundation platform upon the bedrock of the high mountain, so on and so forth, unquote. Now, did you catch the odd phrase, the numeral of my name? What did Sargon mean by that? Now, scholars have proposed that the idea comes from the fact that in Akkadian, which is a cuneiform language, the syllables of Sargon's name can be divided up or individuated. The result is that Sargon's name is 3 cuneiform signs, and each of those signs, not coincidentally, have numerical values. And in this case, amazingly, the sum total of the 3 signs of Sargon's name add up to, guess what? 16,283. The same number in that inscription for the cubits mentioned in what he was building. Now that strongly suggests that the incredibly large number, for instance, there's no building associated with Sargon known to archaeology that had a roof that big, 16,000 plus cubits. It strongly suggests that the incredibly large number is designed specifically to magnify Sargon as king and not give us true math. So how does this apply to the biblical problem of the large numbers in the Exodus and the conquest? Well, if we consider the literary genre of those accounts, again, some sort of historical or military annal designed to do what? Designed to tell us, to inform the reader of the great victories of the Israelites, not really the Israelites, but of Yahweh, the King of the gods, okay, the King of Israel. The accounts give us these figures, these descriptions. If we look at it that way, it can be argued that, like other ancient Near Eastern writers, the biblical writers were using large numbers according to the writing conventions of their own time, which, by the way, argues for their historical authenticity. The point would be that the writer of these accounts was using a known literary device in a known literary genre to draw attention to the might of Yahweh, the King of all kings, earthly or divine, in delivering his people Israel. I hope you see again the value of thinking about the literary genre of a passage of Scripture for understanding it. Here's the key idea: on its own terms, not our terms, in its own context, not my context, not the context of the Reformation or the Middle Ages or whatever, okay? Its own context. Before I sign off, I should note that this discussion was adapted from my notes in the Faith Life Study Bible from Logos Bible Software. I wrote the Study Bible notes for Genesis through Judges in that Study Bible, so if you found this material interesting, I'd encourage you to download the Study Bible for free at www.faithlifebible.com. The coupon code is the word FREE. So until next time, thanks for listening. Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. In the last podcast episode, we continued our series on studying the Bible in light of its various types of literature, its literary genres. We're going to continue that effort in this episode and shift gears into the New Testament. I'll be quoting from a couple of scholarly journal articles in this episode, and so I've placed the references for those articles on the podcast website, www.nakedbiblepodcast.com, under the Bibliography and Resources tab by episode. I want to look today at two familiar episodes in the life of Jesus. The incident where he walks on the water and his disciples think they are seeing a ghost, and his appearances to the disciples after his resurrection. It may sound surprising, but the ancient world of which the New Testament was part actually had many stories about ghosts and what scholars call post-mortem appearances of the dead. As such, these sorts of stories, as scholars have collected and studied them, form genres. And since they form genres, story types, so to speak, there are stock elements in each of these genres that came to be expected by readers in the ancient world. In other words, when somebody wrote a ghost story or a story about someone coming back from the dead in the Greco-Roman period, there were expected components in those stories. There was a way you wrote one if you were an effective writer and communicator. Now, taking all that into consideration, New Testament scholars look at how the New Testament writers both utilized and subverted these genres and their elements in their attempts to communicate what it was they experienced and believed about Jesus. You've probably heard preachers or Christian apologists claim that the New Testament stories about Jesus' resurrection and his miracles are unique. That's actually a bit misleading. The New Testament writers both conform to and subvert these genres. What do I mean? Well, on one hand, scholars know that the New Testament writers utilize virtually all the expected ghost story elements in writing about Jesus' appearance on the sea, as well as the elements expected in post-mortem appearances. In that sense, there isn't much that's new. Even details like Jesus eating by the seaside and his challenge to Thomas to touch his body and his wounds after the resurrection, those sorts of things can be found in classical Greek sources about ghosts and post-mortem appearances. In Greco-Roman literature, sometimes ghosts were conceived of as physical. Now that might sound odd, especially when it comes to the resurrection. It might make you wonder what's different then if that's the case. Well, the difference and the subversion of the literary elements of these genres comes when the writers recast certain elements or combine them in bizarre ways or sort of go beyond them, as though the stock ways of describing a ghost or a person back from the dead just aren't good enough to describe what's going on with Jesus. And frankly, that's the point. Let's take both literary categories in order. We'll begin with the story of Jesus walking on the water and the disciples' misapprehension, that's being kind, that they were seeing a ghost. There's a recent scholarly article on this subject using a literary approach by Jason Robert Combs entitled "A Ghost on the Water? Understanding an Absurdity in Mark chapter 6, verses 49 through 50. And that was published by the Journal of Biblical Literature in 2008. Again, the reference is on the website. Now, if you can handle Greek, I recommend reading that article. I think you'll find it fascinating. If you don't read Greek, let me quote part of the author's conclusion. Writing about Mark's version of the incident with Jesus walking on the water, Combs says, quote, Mark presents several themes typical of classical ghost stories before diverging in a significant way. It is night, the time when there is at least the threat of phantoms looming. Jesus sees the disciples struggling to cross the lake against the wind and begins to walk toward them as light from the dawning sun has barely begun to illuminate their surroundings. It's the perfect time to see a phantom. Yet it's not the nighttime hour nor the dim-lit sky to which Mark attributes the disciples' misconstrual of Jesus. Instead, he implies that their misunderstanding comes from, quote, seeing him walking on the sea, unquote. That's Mark 6:49. The irony is that Mark suggests that the disciples thought that Jesus was a ghost when they witnessed him doing the one thing, at least according to Greco-Roman ghost stories and their elements, doing the one thing that ghosts absolutely cannot do, and that is walk on water, unquote. Now, I'm hoping you follow the point that Combs is trying to make here. He's saying that the writer, Mark, knows, again, he's tuned in to the material, the Greco-Roman material, the way that you'd write one of these ghost stories and what you'd have ghosts doing. But he has Jesus walking on the water. And so the literate reader of Mark would have known that, no, wait a minute, this can't be a ghost because ghosts don't walk on water. That's just not what ghosts do in ghost stories. But again, the disciples come out sort of clueless. Let me continue with what Combs says. Quote again, the Jewish and Greco-Roman audience familiar with the sort of ghost stories recounted above in this article would have been particularly dumbfounded by the disciples' misunderstanding. If, in addition to that, one considers the research of Professor Yarbrough Collins, who's a New Testament scholar, then the disciples' misunderstanding becomes even more shocking. Professor Collins, as noted previously, reviews a wealth of Greco-Roman sources that describe divine men and gods walking on water. With so many prominent accounts, Mark's audience would have certainly understood Jesus' water walk in terms of divine manifestation, and yet the disciples in Mark do not. Unquote. Now again, here's the point Combs is trying to make. Anyone familiar with the literature, the literary elements of a ghost story, would have known that Mark was not describing a ghost. He was describing a god, some divine figure. Mark cast the disciples as basically spiritually clueless or blind to something that should have been obvious. One more quote. Combs adds, quote, in Mark, the disciples' insistence on believing the absurd seems to emphasize to the extreme their failure to believe in Jesus. This is exactly what Mark records. After Jesus identifies himself, Mark describes the astonishment of the disciples, their lack of understanding, and the reason for that lack. Their hearts were hardened. That's Mark 6:51 and 52. The disciples' lack of understanding has long been recognized as a Markan theme that appears throughout the gospel. Here it forms a striking narrative portrayal of cognitive dissonance. The disciples clearly want Jesus to be something that he's not, to the point that they are willing to believe the absurd when Jesus approaches them as something much grander than they had imagined. Gods and divine men walk on water. Ghosts do not. But when the disciples see Jesus walking on the water, they believe the impossible rather than the obvious. Unquote. When it comes to the post-mortem resurrection accounts, shifting gears now to this other material about Jesus, another scholar, Deborah Thompson Prince, has produced an important literary study of how post-mortem appearances are described in classical Greek literature. Her article is entitled The Ghost, quote-unquote, of Jesus, Luke 24 in light of ancient narratives of post-mortem apparitions. That was published in the Journal for the Study of the New Testament in 2007. I'll quote from her work as we continue, but listeners should know again that I've posted 2 images of 2 appendixes at the end of her article. The appendixes list out the characteristics of post-mortem apparition appearances in Greco-Roman literature, and how the gospel writers apply and subvert them in their descriptions about Jesus. So after you're done listening here, I invite you to go up and take a look at that. Now, back to Prince's article, focusing specifically as she does on Luke 24. After a thorough investigation of the elements of post-mortem appearances in Greek literature, Prince writes this, quote, "I submit that the method at work in Luke 24 is an attempt to disorient the reader in order to reconfigure the traditions known to the author and the reader in light of the disciples' extraordinary experience of the resurrected Jesus. After all, Luke can only describe Jesus' post-resurrection appearances with the vocabulary and literary models he has at his disposal. But what if these are deemed inadequate for his purpose, and no one type of apparition is thought sufficient to represent what the disciples had experienced? In this case, Luke would be left with insufficient language and models. If, however, all possible models are incorporated, thereby displaying the breadth and magnitude of Jesus' resurrected presence, while at the same time the limitations of each model are highlighted, then the author is able to work within the parameters of the literary and cultural expectations of the audience to express a phenomenon that surpasses those expectations." Unquote. As with the earlier episode in Mark, a literate reader in the early Christian centuries would have read the accounts of the resurrected Jesus and known that the writer was just at a loss to describe what the disciples had experienced. It would have telegraphed a simple but profound message, like something like this. Hey, we'll do the best we can to describe this, but all the ways you and I are used to thinking about a return from the dead, they just don't cut it. This is beyond anything we can adequately express. Once again, I hope you'll be encouraged and motivated to read your Bible in its own context, using the resources I discussed in earlier episodes of the podcast. You can find this sort of material. You just have to know where to look. Welcome once again to the Naked Bible Podcast. In the last podcast episode, we continued our series on studying the Bible in light of its various types of literature, its literary genres. We looked at an example related to the New Testament, how the literary features of Greco-Roman phantom tales and post-mortem appearances of the dead inform our reading of New Testament resurrection accounts. In this episode, we're going to focus on a type of literature that appears in both Testaments, but which is most familiar in the New Testament, the parable. Now, in most basic terms, a parable is a short story with two levels of meaning, a literalistic one, or a surface meaning to the story, and a more abstract meaning, often a theological meaning when it comes to the New Testament. For this reason, it's common to describe a parable as a story where the elements of the story are familiar and coherent in a literal telling and in a literal interpretation, but where those elements also might symbolize or represent something quite different in literal terms, but still be conceptually related in the more abstract terms. The familiar parable of Jesus about the lost sheep is useful for grasping what I'm talking about here. The narrative about sheep being lost and without a shepherd is quite easily understood literally. But the sheep, it turns out, represent people. And in this case, people without Jesus, the great shepherd. People and sheep are literally distinct, but in the context of the parable, they are conceptually or abstractly related. The same goes for the shepherd and Jesus himself. Now, scholars generally recognize 7 parables in the Old Testament. They are 2 Samuel 12, Nathan's parable to David about the poor man and his little ewe lamb. Then there's one in 2 Samuel 14. The woman from Tekoa tells a story about her 2 sons. 1 Kings 20, we read about The prophet of Yahweh, whose performance parable, he actually acts things out, condemns King Ahab. Then there's the song parable of the vineyard in Isaiah 5. And Ezekiel, there are several. The eagles and the vine in Ezekiel 17. The lioness and her cubs in Ezekiel 19. And then finally, and also in Ezekiel 19, the parable of the vine. But for the most part, discussion about parables is really New Testament oriented. So what we're going to say will focus a lot on the New Testament, but it's applicable to the Old Testament parables as well. Now, the interpretation of parables has long been in dispute by scholars. Craig Blomberg, a professor at Denver Seminary, in his scholarly but I think pretty accessible book entitled Interpreting the Parables, summarizes the consensus of mainstream New Testament scholars in several ways. Among them are, number one, he writes, throughout the history of the church, most Christians interpreted the parables as purely allegories. Number two, modern scholarship, on the other hand, has rightly rejected allegorical interpretation, again, so the consensus goes, in favor of an approach which sees each parable as making only one main point. Third, nevertheless, the parables as they appear in the Gospels do have a few undeniably allegorical elements, but these are the exceptions and not the rule. And lastly, number four, Blomberg says, thus the occasional explicit interpretations of parables in the Gospels are additional exceptions to Jesus' usual practice, and they too are not to be taken as normative. Now, Blomberg is actually less than comfortable with these conclusions. He notes that, quote, Jesus' parables, according to the generally held principles of interpretation, are intended to reveal and not to conceal, unquote. The problem is that Mark 4:11 and 12 gives pretty much the opposite explanation as to why Jesus taught in parables. That passage reads, and he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. Unquote. So we can see what Jesus is telling his listeners, the disciples and others, but basically the disciples, is that those of you who believe, you understand that the kingdom of God, your eyes have been opened. But for those who do not believe, these parables are what I'm going to use, and they're just not going to get it. Okay? And there's sort of a deliberate feel to it, like Mark 4:12 said, lest they should turn and be forgiven. They may indeed hear but not understand. So parables, according to Mark 4, are really about concealing truths, not revealing them. So it's kind of the opposite of the New Testament scholarly consensus. So Blomberg, therefore, looks at the parables a bit differently. And he's not alone, as other scholars are with him in these points, but he contends basically two things. One, the parables as they stand in the Gospels are much more allegorical than is usually acknowledged. And number two, many parables probably make more than one main point. Now, Blomberg goes on to admit, though, and I'll quote him again here, that beyond this, little agreement exists, and it's easy to swing too far back in the direction of deriving too many points from a passage. One noted writer, Blomberg continues, has recently argued for seeing a theological cluster of points in each passage, and in his exposition these may number as many as 10. Without going to these extremes, however, one does have to be willing to look for multiple points in a parable, unquote. Now catch what Blomberg just said. He's saying, look, they're a lot more allegorical than the mainstream scholarly position would contend. And so we need to be open to allegorical meaning in the parables. But we don't want to go too far. We don't want to make like everything in the parable allegorical. Now, if I would restate Blomberg's 2 points a little more positively, I would do it something like this. When approaching a parable, we have to recognize, again, two things. They're going to be allegorical. That is, now catch this, there are going to be at least two levels of meaning. At least two levels of meaning. Again, my own 2 cents here on furthering this thought would be that only taking parables literally, or even primarily literally, is to interpret them out of their own literary context. Now, I mentioned this first item, and again, add a little elaboration to it, because I've often encountered Bible teachers or pastors or whatever that want to look at a parable and take everything absolutely literally. And frankly, what results in that is kind of bizarre in certain contexts. So what I'm saying is, look, parables are not meant to be taken only literally. If you do that, you're interpreting them out of their context, their own context. And this whole series has been devoted to the idea that interpreting the Bible in context means interpreting it in its own context, not ours or what we want, some context that we want to be the case. A second thought, going back to Blomberg's notion that parables will make at least one main point, at least one, but there may be others, and that there will be a more abstract meaning that corresponds to that literal meaning. We need to, again, just to elaborate a little bit, the passage in which a parable is found often has Jesus telling us what his main thought was. I don't know if you've noticed that. As you read through the Gospels, you look at the parables, Jesus will also often give the story, the parable, and then when he gets to explanation, either someone asks him or he offers it, he follows it up right away, or even sometime later, he'll tell people what the main idea was, what the point. And he also often tells you if he had more than one thought for using that parable. In other words, we probably ought to let the New Testament, Jesus' own interpretation of parables, his own technique, if you will, his own method, we probably ought to let that influence the way we look at parables. We'll never find Jesus abstracting every blasted feature of a parable. So frankly, I think we ought to discipline ourselves not to do that. And let's use Jesus as an example for how to interpret the parables. Now, the real problem, as many see it, is whether to look for an abstract meaning in the entirety of the parable, what I just mentioned, every detail, or whether each element of a parable ought to be abstracted, as many times and as often, as frequently, as creatively as possible. Now, ancient interpreters were notorious for doing this. They were notorious for taking every last little word of a parable and finding some abstract meaning, which resulted in dozens of presumed quote-unquote meanings for any given parable. Now, to avoid this sort of abuse, Blomberg and others that I've read have some safeguards. They have some recommendations. So I'm going to give you this list as well. Number one, this is more or less a summary. Modern interpreters should look for meanings in those points of parables that Jesus' original audience would have discerned. That's another way of saying that we should restrict the points for abstraction, for allegorizing in interpretation. We should restrict the points for abstraction to the ones Jesus' hearers would have understood, not points that we would understand and they wouldn't. Okay? So we should restrict the points for abstraction to the ones Jesus' hearers would have understood, and the Gospels frequently do that. As I mentioned before, they have Jesus telling us, or the writer telling us, what elements Jesus was focused on when giving the parable. I think that's a good warning against abstracting a parable for our own time and context. That's a flawed interpretive strategy. We can apply it to our context, but to say that this parable means X, Y, Z, that only a modern audience would connect with, that is a flawed strategy. And it's frankly taking a parable out of its own context. Now, number two, Blomberg specifically advises, quote, the main characters of a parable will probably be the most common candidates for allegorical interpretation, and the main points of the parable will most likely be associated with those characters, unquote. That's frequently overt in the parables. Again, if you read them, you'll see this happening. It's very common. It's where the writer tells readers what to focus on, and so it becomes a good guiding rule of thumb for us. Third, And lastly, we ought to recall that Mark 4 said the parables were for obscuring the teaching about the kingdom of God to those who weren't following Jesus. That means that the parables are really about the kingdom of God, the reign of God, and the realm of God. So as such, they ought not to be seen as focused exclusively on Israel or exclusively on the church, but on the collective people of God, the present believing community of God, and the one who reigns as king, Jesus. Ideas that are peripheral to these core issues take the interpreter beyond the purpose of the parables that Jesus himself just told us. So as such, we ought to be very wary of taking parables any further than he did. I hope these guidelines for interpreting parables are useful. We know they're important because of why Jesus used the method. Their purpose, and therefore their context, needs to frame our own method of interpretation, lest we go beyond what the New Testament actually demonstrates. Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. In the last episode, we continued our series on studying the Bible in light of its various types of literature, its literary genres. And again, a genre is a kind of literature. We looked at parables last time and offered some guidelines for interpreting them. In this episode, we're going to briefly look at another familiar type of biblical literature that is, sad to say, at times badly misunderstood, and that is the proverb. It's probably best to start with what proverbs are. In a nutshell, proverbs are time-tested truths. They are axiomatic sayings that, by and large, are shown to be correct in life. That's why they're typically found in literature that is called wisdom literature. The nature of a proverb is to dispense some sort of truism in a memorable way. And since they are by definition short, pithy sayings, their brevity doesn't provide space for addressing all the possible contingencies or exceptions to them that could arise. I like the way that biblical scholars Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart put it very clearly and concisely when they wrote, quote, "Proverbs are worded to be memorable rather than to be technically precise," unquote. So if that's what proverbs are, then how are they misunderstood? How should we not look at proverbs? I would say that there are two fundamentally flawed perspectives that need attention in this regard. One would be that proverbs are not unconditional promises. And second, proverbs are not prophecies either. In other words, proverbs bring with them no expectation of guaranteed outcomes. To read a biblical proverb and assume a guaranteed outcome as though the statement was a prophecy is to take that proverb out of its literary context and therefore produce flawed and perhaps even damaging interpretation. Now, the true nature of proverbs versus their common misunderstandings is easy to illustrate in the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. Let me give you a few examples. Proverbs 15:22 says, "Without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed." Well, is that always true? If you look out in the business world or a military engagement or something smaller like how I'm going to get through college, or you pick any area of life where you can look at an outcome and it's either a success or a failure. Is it guaranteed that every person's success in all occasions came about as a result of careful planning? Well, no. But for the most part, you would think that would be the case, and it probably is. The more advice you get, the more you think about that advice, the better the outcome will probably be because you put more thought into it. Again, the proverb is a truism. It's an axiom. It's something that's true at most times, in most places, on most occasions, but not always. It's not guaranteed. Let me give you another one. Proverbs 16:31. Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life. Now, this one's obviously not true in terms of, the numbers, okay? It's obviously not true that anyone you meet with a gray head of hair is a righteous person. But again, that isn't the point of the proverb. Again, if you understand that verse, that proverb, in the way it's supposed to be understood, again, giving you some truism of life, and you put it back, especially into the biblical world, since the lifespan of people was a lot shorter than it is today, and since it was believed that you reached a long life, you were old enough to get that gray head of hair, which wasn't terribly typical, again, in a world where the average lifespan might have only been 40 or 50 years old. I mean, look at the colonial period here in the United States, in North America. Lifespans, again, into the 40s and 50s. I mean, if you got to the age where you had a good set of gray hair, the assumption was that God was blessing you, okay, that through the providence of God, you got to be that old. So again, it's a truism that fits its context, but it's not a scientific statement. It's not even a theological statement. That's all-encompassing. But it reflects an idea that's very consistent, very understandable within the biblical world. Another one, Proverbs 29:12. If a ruler listens to falsehood, all his officials will be wicked. Really? Just because a leader listens to falsehood or is deceived, whether, or even if they listen to it deliberately, they just like it, and so they go with advice that they know to not be true. That doesn't mean that everyone who works for him is going to be wicked. Exhibit A, Daniel, in the book of Daniel, working for a number of pagan administrations. It's just not meant to be all-encompassing, something that's always true in every situation at all times. But again, in general, for the most part, if a ruler listens to falsehood, his administration could turn out to be corrupt. Again, it's a truism. It's just something that's mostly true, that over the course of time would bear out to be true in most circumstances. Again, a good piece of advice. One more, Proverbs 29:16. When the wicked increase, transgression increases, but the righteous will look upon their downfall. Well, we all know that it's not a given, it's not a universal, that Christians, believers, the righteous, who are in situations where they're ruled by wicked rulers, it's not a given that that circumstance is going to turn around in their lifetime, in the lifetime of the righteous. The righteous may not get to see vindication in this life. Again, the proverb itself is not making some sort of universal theological statement or universal statement about reality. A proverb is a short, pithy saying that either dispenses advice or gives you some sort of axiomatic truth that, again, over the course of time, more chances than not, it's going to turn out that way. Now, perhaps the most well-known example of how important it is to understand the nature of a proverb is Proverbs 22, verse 6. And you may have it memorized. I'm sure you've heard of it. It says, "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." Now, treating this proverb as though it is an unconditional promise or a prophecy, something with a guaranteed outcome, has given more anguish to more people, I think, than probably any other verse in the book of Proverbs. We all know situations where we have faithful believers who have made a good faith attempt, in some cases an extraordinary attempt, to get their children to follow them in their faith, and they just don't. The children, either through immaturity or rebellion, just go their own way. They stray, and in some cases they come back. Other times they don't. Again, there's a certain randomness to that. And you look at this verse, and if you're looking at a proverb, again, as though it's supposed to have some guaranteed outcome, well, then it's very natural for you to look at yourself as a parent and beat yourself up over it. Oh, if I had only made them read their Bible 10 more minutes per day, it would have been different. Oh, if I had prayed for them X number of times per day, or at a certain time of day for a certain number of days in a row, things would have been different. Again, you're left puzzling and anguishing over the fact that you didn't quite get the right formula, or you didn't quite, do something so that the magic would work. Or even worse, you didn't quite do something so that God would have looked down at your child and said, well, I'm going to open that person's heart. I'm going to steer them in a direction to bring them back. I would do that if only you, Mr. or Mrs. Parent, would just do this other thing just this precise way. Then I could bless you and your kid. Again, that's just a self-torture that's completely unnecessary and frankly completely unbiblical. And it stems from a flawed mindset that ignores the literary context of what you're looking at in your Bible. So I hope this short foray into the nature of Proverbs is in some way helpful. Again, we do the Bible an injustice when we fail to take it for what it is, or simply refuse to do so if it doesn't suit our own beliefs or our own traditions. Proverbs can quite easily be distorted so as to manipulate people, and they ought not to be used to harm someone emotionally or crush our own spirit. Until next time. Welcome to another episode of the Naked Bible Podcast. We're going to be continuing with our series on studying Scripture in its own context, and specifically its own literary contexts. With this episode, we're going to shift gears a little bit, though. I'm going to be conducting an interview. Stop. 3, 2, 1. This past week, I was fortunate to have a friend in town, Dr. Sam Lamerson from Knox Theological Seminary in Florida, and I interviewed Sam about genre study. Sam specifically has an interest in the comedic genre, which may surprise you as far as being related to the study of the New Testament, but that's why I wanted to interview him. A little bit more about Sam. He has his PhD from Trinity International University, formerly known as Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. That's in Deerfield, Illinois, near Chicago. And he also has over 15 years of pastoral experience. He's currently, in addition to his professorship duties, an associate pastor at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. He was the interim morning preaching and teaching pastor during the illness of Dr. D. James Kennedy. Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, of course, was Dr. Kennedy's church. Sam did that for many months, perhaps even close to a year, before that church called its new pastor. So Sam has a lot of pastoral experience. He's good at making things simple. And so I wanted to interview him as part of our Naked Bible Podcast series. So what you'll hear next is my interview with Dr. Sam Lamerson. I'm here with Professor Sam Lamerson of Knox Theological Seminary. Sam teaches New Testament at Knox, and he's a friend of mine. So I thought, since we had opportunity to spend some time together near where I live, down at Logos, that I would talk to Sam a little bit about what we've been talking about on the podcast, and that is literary genre and how that helps to interpret the Bible, some of the things that it contributes. And so, Sam, thanks for being here.
No problem. Glad to be here, Mike.
I was wondering, just in general, how much would you say that your students that you get at Knox, your introductory New Testament students, how many of them have ever really thought about the importance of a literary approach or genre to what they do in terms of either Bible study or sermon preparation or things like that?
When they come, it's pretty unlikely that they've thought very much about that, but I try to, particularly in the hermeneutics course, I try to spend a good bit of time helping them to think about how genre affects how they look at the text and how the text was meant to be interpreted, how the author meant for the original readers to understand it. So we spend a good bit of time thinking about those kind of things.
What kind of exercises do you have them do, or do you just more or less introduce them topically to the study?
I introduce them topically to the study, and then we do some things like looking at the difference between, for example, a parable and a historical incident, and realizing that there are certain clues in the text that help us to realize that, for example, a parable is not to be taken as a literary story or as a literal story, but on the other hand, a historical incident, the author means for us to take it as an actual incident that really happened.
Now, one of the I guess we can call it a genre. You can correct me if that's wrong, but I know that you've done a lot of work studying comedy in ancient literature, and I've heard you speak once about the use of comedy in the Bible, and I was wondering if you could say a few things about that. Things like what are the stock elements, just a few of them that go into that particular genre, and where you see comedy in the Bible. Where does that play out?
Sure. Aristotle will talk about 4 different genres. There's tragic, there's comedic, there's poetic, and then there's the long story that eventually is fulfilled. And by the comedic, Aristotle will tell us that there's a way that we can tell the difference between a comedic story and a tragic story. And essentially, a tragic story starts out high with everything good and ends low, usually with a funeral. A comedic story, on the other hand, usually starts out low with some kind of serious problem, but then ends high, often in a wedding. And so if you think of even the romantic comedies that you've seen in the movies, often they will end with a wedding. And often they will begin with some sort of a problem. The problem is whether or not the groom will ever be able to really get the bride. And probably a really good example of this is Shrek. Shrek is ugly, and he's an ogre, and he's not the kind of person that a beautiful girl would want to marry. And yet he falls in love with beautiful Fiona. And so there's this dramatic tension there. Can Shrek ever convince Fiona that he's worth marrying? And eventually, of course, through a variety of different things, Shrek and Fiona end up married. And that's the high point of the comedy. It's the point where Shrek and Fiona get married, or in The Princess and the Bride, when Buttercup marries Wesley. Any of those kinds of films like that, you'll see very common. The groom is either socially awkward or something wrong with him, and he somehow has to overcome those obstacles to show himself worthy of being married by the beautiful girl. And then he gets married finally, and that's the happily ever after.
So, yeah, it made me think of, as you were talking there, the I don't know if I can remember the actor's name, but the Mall Cop movie, which is the same kind of thing where he's just completely
Kevin James.
Yeah, Kevin James, just not what the lead female figure in the movie would ever find in any way interesting or attractive, and you get to see him do some pretty stupid things along the way that reinforce the incongruity of the match. So I imagine to an ancient audience, you'd have some of that in there too, that they would recognize immediately what a mismatch this is.
Right. And so in the early Greek comedies, often what will happen is that you will have some sort of a serious problem, and there will be someone who's going to try to take care of the problem. And he's called, interestingly enough, in classical Greek, the paneros. He is the loser, essentially. He's this sort of Chaplin-esque kind of character who's short and unable to do things and would never be able to really save the world. And yet, by the end of the comedy, we see the paneros, the loser, the person whom we would never expect to be able to change the world, actually doing that which is necessary to save the world, get the girl, and eventually get married. And it's an amazing thing to realize that this character of the paneros is exactly the character we see in Jesus Christ. He is born in a small, little tiny town. He's not famous. He's not born in Rome. There are no fireworks that go off when he's born. And anyone looking at his birth and his childhood would have said, anybody who thinks that this man is going to change the world needs their head examined.
Yeah, nothing significant at all going on.
Nothing going on. And yet, amazingly enough, he, being the paneros in the classical sense, does indeed change the world through his death. And it's just an incredible sort of comedic. There's a sense in which we can see the gospel as comedic, not in the sense that the crucifixion is funny or anything like that, but because of the sense that by every stretch of the imagination, it ought to end up poorly, but through the amazing grace of God and through this person whom we would never expect to change the world, God uses his Son to save his people and change the world and marry his bride, the church, and eventually live happily ever after.
So I think if we can summarize the point, if you were a reader, let's say, of one of the Gospels, and you were familiar, again, with this type of material, the characters, sort of the expectations of how things are going to begin, you could actually pick up on some of that in the Gospel, is what you're saying. As you read through the life of Jesus, at least initially, there's just nothing there that would ever indicate that this is a character of note. You'd almost wonder, well, why did anyone produce a story about this guy? And then things just sort of proceed along, and you get this, amazing ending. So someone who is familiar with that could pick up those message points as they read through a gospel.
Exactly right. And they would begin to realize that anyone in the first century would think that a crucified Messiah was a failed Messiah, that was a simple example of the fact that you had bet on the wrong horse, so to speak, that the guy who you thought was the Messiah wasn't the Messiah because he was crucified. And yet, amazingly enough, this crucified Messiah begins to change the world through his resurrection. And you see then that this is an amazing comedic genre. The whole gospel is really comedic. And there's a wonderful book by Frederick Buechner called The Gospel as Comedy, Tragedy, and Fairy Tale. And he goes into these genres and shows how the gospel does indeed fit the genre of comedy and fit the genre of tragedy and eventually fit the genre of fairy tale, not because it's not true, but because it's the greatest of all fairy tales, the fairy tale that really is true, in which things do all turn out right. It's just like in the end of The Lord of the Rings, when Sam realizes that his friends aren't dead, and he has that great line. He says, "Is everything bad going to come undone?" And amazingly enough, everything bad does indeed come undone through this Poneros, whom we would never expect, through this Jesus Christ.
I think this is a good illustration, too. Sometimes it's a struggle to communicate what is meant by genre. And in the description of this, maybe a modern term would be that there's a formula for producing a particular story. And if you violate that formula, then people could be confused, listening to it or watching it if it's a TV show. There would be conventions, there would be parts of the formula that make it what it is, and that can produce the desired result in the reader or the listener or the viewer.
Right. And so sometimes, for example, in the parables, those formulas will be intentionally violated to sort of shock the reader. And sometimes that shock can be comedic. One of the most obvious examples is in Matthew 18, where Jesus tells the story of a man who owed 10,000 talents. And those who were listening at the time would have immediately laughed at that, because they would have known that no one could owe 10,000 talents. It would be the equivalent today of saying that you sent your daughter off to college with a visa, and when she came home for Christmas, she had charged up the national debt. You would say, well, there's some kind of a limit. That can't really happen. No one could have owed 10,000 talents. It was more money than the Roman government had at the time. So when Jesus says there was a man who owed 10,000 talents, it's immediately comedic. But then he goes on and pushes the joke a little bit more, because when the king says to the man, you need to pay me back the 10,000 talents, which of course would have been impossible, the man says, give me a little bit more time. And obviously, if you owed 10,000 talents, if you owed the national debt, having a little bit more time is not going to help you. And so that is a case where the parable starts out comedically, but ends tragically with the man eventually being cast into outer darkness because of his unwillingness to accept the forgiveness that was offered to him.
Wow, that's a good example. Do you have any other examples in the New Testament or the Old, but that really sort of stand out in this way?
Sure, there are lots of them. For example, Jesus saying it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Sometimes you'll hear people who haven't studied that passage carefully say that that was sort of a door that a camel could get through if he unburdened himself, but that's not really the case. What Jesus is saying is it's easier for a literal camel to go through the eye of a literal surgical needle, and Luke uses the word for surgical needle in the Greek text. He's saying it's easier for a camel to go through that needle than for a rich man to go to heaven. And that's the reason that the disciples, they don't say, oh, well, you mean this camel that has to get down on its knees? No. They say, this is impossible. And Jesus, of course, then says, yes, it's impossible, but with God all things are possible. Another really interesting example is the example of Zacchaeus. One of the things that we know is Zacchaeus was short, and probably not just short, but really, really short. He was so short that he couldn't see over the people that were around him. And so there's some thought among New Testament scholars that he may have been a short person, like a dwarf. And so Zacchaeus wants to see this man Jesus whom he has heard about. And keep in mind that during this period in history, if you were a dwarf and as a slave, you were worth more than a slave who wasn't handicapped in that way. And that was because the Romans would buy a dwarf and they would then bring him out to dance in front of people at a party, and they would make fun of him and laugh. And this dancing dwarf was kind of something that was very common in the Roman government at the time and among upper-level Roman citizens. And so Zacchaeus, as a dwarf, particularly wearing a robe, would have looked bad running. It was, today we have, people run all the time and it's not that big of a deal, but in the first century, for a man to run was to sort of throw away his dignity. And Zacchaeus, wearing a robe, runs so that he can climb up a tree and see this man Jesus. And so he goes from this poneros, this little man who is hated by everyone, who does all that he can just to get things for himself. And yet when he meets Jesus, the ultimate poneros, Jesus looks up, brings Zacchaeus down, goes to his house, and Zacchaeus' life changes. And there were, at this time in history, often it was considered that it was thought that you could tell about a person's personality by the way that they looked. And the shorter that a person was thought that the more stingy that they were. And so Zacchaeus sort of fits into that mold. He's a tax collector who's taking all that he can for himself. But then he meets Jesus, and Jesus changes him. And all of a sudden, he may be small on the inside now. He may be comedic on the outside. People may be looking at him and laughing at him. But when he meets Jesus, his life is changed. And he changes from that person who is getting all that he can for himself to that person who wants to do the right thing and to pay back that which he has stolen. And that is the sort of happy ending that we see in a comedic story, that person whom you would never expect to change or to be changed is suddenly changed in an amazing way. And in this case, because he meets the ultimate changer of men, Jesus Christ.
Well, thanks for spending a little time with us today. I'm sure the listeners will get a good bit out of this. And again, it's just a good example of, you read through the New Testament and some of these things are so familiar, but they have a background. There's something against which, that if they're understood, there are details in the story that just become a lot clearer and frankly just become more meaningful as well. And we can sort of get inside the heads and the minds and the hearts of the people who would have been able to appreciate each element of a story like that. Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. In our last podcast, we talked about the comedic genre in the New Testament with our guest speaker, Sam Lamerson. In this episode, we're going to talk about two genres as we continue our series on interpreting the Bible in its own literary context. This time we're going to talk about the genres of prophecy and apocalyptic. The reason for doubling up will become apparent as we proceed, but basically we need to talk about these two genres because most modern Bible students don't realize that there are clear differences between the two. That is, most people assume that prophecy has something to do with predicting the end times or the end of the world. But that's actually not technically correct. It's the apocalyptic genre that does that. Let's take prophecy first, toward articulating and understanding the difference between the two. In simplest terms, prophecy is what a prophet says. Sermons or speeches of prophets or prophetic figures in the Bible. If you actually read through the prophets, you'll find that most of the time they don't predict anything. They rail against something. That's why in any academic study of the prophets, the distinction will be made between a prophet's forthtelling, that is, his preaching and diatribes against someone or something, and his foretelling, his actual prediction of future events. About 80% of the prophetic material in the Bible actually falls into the first category, forthtelling, preaching. That is, messages for the prophet's immediate audience about their own time and their own failures, and hence their own near future if they refuse to repent. Prophets were broadly defined someone who acted as a spokesperson for God, just someone generically who spoke God's truth. The biblical prophets were basically covenant enforcers, is the way I like to describe it. That is, they railed against the unrighteousness of the people, the kings, or other nations, declaring how they were out of bounds in some way with God's covenants or God's holiness. So consequently, predicting future events was not their main focus. And even when prophets did predict future events, they were nearly always oriented to their own time period, the near future of the unrighteous Israelites or the pagan nations that were part of Israel's world. The prophet would often render explicit predictions about the impending doom of Israel or some other nation that were not aimed at future events thousands of years beyond their own time period. That is, the end of the world scenarios. So such predictions as the end of the world scenario are actually rare in Scripture, and they belong to the next genre, apocalyptic. Now, apocalyptic could be thought of as a subset of prophecy, one with features markedly different than normal forthtelling prophecy, and even different than normal predictive prophecy, since most predictions in the prophets are near in view, not far, far distant into the future. The apocalyptic genre describes prophecies in which God reveals hidden future plans that are cataclysmic and designed in some ultimate sense to punish evil and reward the faithful. Apocalyptic prophecy is usually conveyed through dreams or visions with elaborate and strange symbolism, and such apocalyptic predictions are often conveyed through intermediaries like angels. On page 385 of their excellent Introduction to Hermeneutics, entitled Introduction to Biblical Interpretation, William Klein and Craig Blomberg list out the differences between prophecy and apocalyptic. I'm going to post their short chart on the podcast Bibliography and Resources page so that you can take a look at it. But let me read the distinctions to you here. Prophecy versus apocalyptic. Now, prophecy, that genre, focuses on primarily repentance from sin, whereas in the apocalyptic genre, sin is viewed as just too great. We're beyond the point of repenting, and destruction is inevitable. Going back to the prophecy genre, it often deals with God's displeasure with his evil people, whereas apocalyptic has in view the idea that the people's displeasure with evil and the desire for God's intervention. Prophecy focuses on a call for God's people to repent. Apocalyptic focuses on a call for a faithful remnant to persevere through what's coming. Again, this cataclysmic upheaval, the chaos that's going to ensue, sort of again in the day of the Lord or the end of the world scenarios. Prophecy, on the other hand, focuses as well on divine intervention by natural or human means. Apocalyptic, though, describes divine intervention by supernatural means. So the one, prophecy, God uses people to do this or that, to bring either something that comes to pass or bring about repentance. But in apocalyptic, you have supernatural agents that are often involved, again, with this great final cataclysmic judgment that's coming. The prophecy genre also typically contains direct speech by God, whereas the apocalyptic genre often has God speaking in indirect ways. Again, weird symbols, bizarre sorts of language, numbers, that sort of thing. And not only is it indirect in that nature, it's also indirect in that God gives the information through some intermediate figure, often an angel. You think about the book of Revelation, and there are angels in that book that do lots of talking. And finally, prophecy is concerned primarily with the prediction of imminent future events, whereas apocalyptic concerns itself with the prediction of cosmic final events, final solutions. Now that chart highlights some important distinctions of apocalyptic literature that separate it from more common prophecy. The basic distinction is that non-apocalyptic prophecy is A, mostly not predicting anything, it's basically preaching, and B, when it does predict something, it predicts near future events. Now, in that regard, most Old Testament prophecy, therefore, has already been fulfilled, either in the Old Testament period itself or the New Testament period. And so, a lot of Old Testament prophecy that often gets picked up in popular prophecy discussion is really being taken out of context. Most Old Testament prophecy should not be ripped out of its original context and its original fulfillment and made to talk about events future to us. The apocalyptic material of the Old Testament, and of course the New Testament, on the other hand, is a different story. Now, as the chart sketched, apocalyptic material contains veiled and sometimes truly bizarre revelations, often mediated by angels. The material often includes descriptions of activities in the supernatural world. That would be another thing to look for. Now, not mentioned in the chart is also the notion of the division of history into periods and sort of a progression toward this final cataclysmic end. That's very common in apocalyptic literature. It leads to some sort of cosmic transformation, destructive or positive, and those things are stock elements in apocalyptic material. And since those are stock elements, it shouldn't surprise any of us that the judgment of the dead and resurrection is also a big part of the apocalyptic genre. So what do we do about prophecy and apocalyptic? Klein and Blomberg, again, referring back to that book, as well as other academic books on hermeneutics, have a number of recommendations as to how to interpret texts in these genres. I'm going to go over a few of them for you. Number one, since more space is devoted to prophecy than apocalyptic in the Bible, and you can just read through your Old Testament especially and look for the presence or absence of those apocalyptic features we just described, you'll find that more space is devoted to prophecy as a genre than apocalyptic. Since that's the case, we ought not to assume that a prophecy without apocalyptic features is saying anything about the final end times. We need to let Scripture's own genres and their usage guide us here. Number two, the Bible itself is the best guide for determining which prophecies were fulfilled during the Old Testament time period and during the New Testament time period, the biblical period itself. Now, when considering a prediction in the Old Testament prophets, if the passage is not apocalyptic in genre, or if it's clearly quoted or alluded to in the New Testament as being fulfilled, then it's unwise to assume that a prophecy in the Old Testament prophets is pointing to our own time period or some yet distant future. We need to let the Bible provide parameters for us in those regards. Number three, in many and perhaps most cases, Old Testament prophecies about Israel and Zion find their fulfillment in the church by the New Testament's own reckoning and quotation. The book of Hebrews is a good example of temple and Zion theology applied directly to the church. And since the church is a historical entity, this is still historical, real-time fulfillment, but it's something that's already accomplished. If the New Testament is silent about a specific Old Testament prophecy dealing with the physical nation of Israel, then that prophecy might anticipate a future historical fulfillment in that direction. But again, if you're catching the drift here, we're trying to let the New Testament be our guide as to what has been fulfilled and what's still out there. Number four, apocalyptic prophecies' symbols were given to people in the biblical period for their own understanding. That is, while symbols are cryptic and weird, the referent point of a symbol is something knowable to the audience to whom it came and to whom it was given. It might be foreign to us, but they would have understood it. Otherwise, it would be meaningless. Now, that means that symbolic language is not to be deciphered by what we know in our world, but by what they knew in their world. Number five, and finally, When the New Testament assigns meaning and fulfillment to an Old Testament apocalyptic symbol, we ought not disregard it and assume the symbol stands for something in our own world. For example, the locust imagery of the book of Revelation ought to be understood the way the Old Testament uses locust imagery, for invading human armies, not for helicopters or strange hybrid monster creatures from inner Earth or outer space. That would have been utterly meaningless to the original recipients of that kind of material. Well, I hope these guidelines are helpful. I hope the discussion was helpful for distinguishing prophecy and apocalyptic. I think you can see that the rule of thumb in this sort of material is to let the Bible itself be our guide, to honor the genres that God chose to communicate things to us in, and also to honor the way the Bible itself says this or that was fulfilled. And if we do that, it's not going to eliminate the idea of predictive prophecy at a future time yet future to us, but it's going to give us some guideposts and some boundaries that are going to be really helpful, that will keep us from going off the deep end, in some cases literally, when we look at this material in the Bible.